Goeiemôre dames en here en welkom by die eerste sessie van Nasie in Gesprek by NAMPO 2025. Dis die 13de jaar wat ons hierdie Nasie in Gesprek aanbied en ek wil net eerstens vir ons borge dankie sê, want sonder hulle is hierdie nie moontlik nie. Ons gaan in die volgende 3 dae baie goeie temas bespreek en ek dink is relevante temas en ons het uitstekende sprekers waarna ons kan uitsien. As ons kyk na vandag se sessie, gaan dit oor iets wat naby in ons vel is. Die wat in die platteland woon en besigheid doen, verstaan wat beteken as infrastruktuur agteruit gaan en nie in stand gehou word nie. So Lorenza, baie dankie dat jy hierdie sessie vir ons gaan fasiliteer. Ons sien baie uit na die gesprekke en ook die oplossings wat vir ons gaan gebied word, sodat ons die plattelandse infrastruktuur weer kan opbou. Ons gaan net gou eers kyk na 'n inleidende video en dan gaan ons oorgee vir die paneel.
In the heart of South Africa's rural landscape, a quiet revolution is taking place. Our agricultural sector, one of the most vital pillars of our economy, is being held together not just by hard work and resilience, but by the sheer determination of those who refuse to wait. Faced with crumbling roads, unreliable energy and limited water systems, South Africa's farmers, agribusinesses and cooperatives are stepping up, investing in infrastructure, often at their own cost, to keep food on the table and exports moving. From paving back roads to powering farms with off-grid energy, rural communities are taking action, creating a de facto system of privatised infrastructure born out of necessity.
Net soos die res van die land sukkel die boere ook met die onderhoud van infrastruktuur, die paaie wat versleg daagliks. En dit maak dit vir ons moeilik om ons produk by die verbruiker aan die einde van die dag uit te kom, die verwerkingsplek. En ook vir ons vrouens en ons kinders en ons plaaswerkings op die dorpe uit te kom, by die skole uit te kom. En daar met die landboubesighede en dan veral Sinwes hande gevat met die gemeenskap, hande gevat met die boere. En in ons gebied meer as 3.500 kilometer geskraap om juist 'n bietjie terug te ploeg in die gemeenskap, te help, ondersteuning te gee, maar ook dit vir ons moontlik te maak om ons kos wat ons produseer op die verbruiker se tafel te kry.
But while these efforts are commendable, they are not enough. For South African agriculture to truly thrive, rural infrastructure must be strategically aligned, policy supported and scalable.
Dysfunctional infrastructure is cutting 3 percentage points off growth in our national economy. And that growth and the opportunities foregone from it impacts directly on the production cost of a farmer. So if we had effective electricity available and if we had functional logistics infrastructure systems, all our farmers could be more competitive in foreign markets than what they are at the moment.
Die retoriek was altyd dat infrastruktuur belangrik is. Elke administrasie het daar met dit beklemtoon. Maar nou kry ons 'n bietjie meer vet aan die been in terme van beleid wat ontwikkel word om hierdie soort van infrastruktuur geleide ekonomiese groei te ondersteun. In terme van die PPP's, die regulasies of die raamwerk wat tesorie onlangs vrygestel het, is eintlik baie optimisties ontvang deur die mark. Dit maak die proses heel wat makliker. Dit gee staatsentiteite die geleenthede om PPP's vir spesifieke projekte binne hulle departemente te lei, plaas van dat dit te veel gesentraliseer word, sodat heel wat optimistiese bewegings in die mark, dis nog nie grond wat gebreek is nie. En daar's beleide, dis goed en wel, maar totdat ons die eintlike geld sien, totdat ons eintlik die konstruksieaktiwiteit sien, is dit bietjie vroeg om te sê dat dit die positiewe uitwerking sal hê wat ons hoop.
We must move beyond patchwork solutions. It's time to rethink how public policy can meet private initiative, to strengthen partnerships, to drive investment, and to empower the rural economy with the tools it needs to flourish. This is not just about productivity, it's about progress. About creating a rural South Africa where infrastructure is not a barrier, but a bridge to opportunity, sustainability, and global competitiveness. Welcome to the conversation. Together, let's build the future of farming. brick by brick, road by road, solution by solution.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first discussion of the Nation in Conversation series. My name is Lorenza Eckhard. I'm a journalist and presenter for In Gesprek on Kyknet and Carte Blanche on Mnet. I remember covering these discussions as a junior reporter sitting way at the back, taking notes, listening intently. So it is my privilege and honor to be on the stage today facilitating this important discussion. Now, this morning we are discussing strengthening rural infrastructure to boost agricultural productivity. It's quite a mouthful, but there are some basic issues that I'm sure we'll get to with my panel. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hubert Joint. He is the Program Manager of the Centre of Excellence for Infrastructure South Africa. We have Marlies Nel Verwy. She is the Free State Provincial Manager at Sanral, Boshoff, the CEO of ACBIS, and Moshe Matloy. He is Chief Executive for Rail Infrastructure at Transnet. Now, this is also where I would like to start. Moshe, we here at Transnet, we think of our crumbling rail infrastructure. I think how we should look at this conversation today, let's contextualize the challenges and then let's get to solutions. What are the biggest challenges we have in tackling our crumbling rail infrastructure?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good morning, everyone. When we looked at the infrastructure, we know that for a number of years there's been underinvestment on the rail infrastructure that had led to us losing our shine, if you like. We were not able to maintain it the way we should have. And as a result, cargo started moving from rail to road. Some of the stations lay derelict. Vandalism took over. Then there was no money to put back into the system. Now, government has then looked at the situation to say we needed a policy change in as far as the rail reforms are concerned. From 2023, discussions started happening, which at the high level saying we needed to open up the rail network to more operators than one, meaning you would have Transnet running, but you open opportunities for private sector to come into the rail system. And in opening for them, we then said we're going to look for them to come and invest where they put in money because the government does not have all the money. Then this is a process that has led to us issuing the network statement on the 19th of December last year, where for the first time in the history of South Africa, we opened the rail network to private players to say you can now apply for slots. Initially, it started with 5 slots, but there was an outcry saying, open this. There are more people interested in areas that we were not expecting to see interest. We then had to extend the closing date to the end of February. We opened all corridors. We then received 98 applications, to our pleasant surprise, across different corridors, rural, urban, and otherwise, where our teams right now are busy assessing those applications. But then for us, we then said, if we are going to move forward, there are 4 battles that we must win. The first one really is to say the infrastructure must be upgraded so that it is able to support the movement of freight and give the competitive advantage to those who want a cheaper, environmental friendly mode of transport and move the trucks from road to rail. The second battle that we must win is to say having that infrastructure is not adequate if it is not secured, because there's vandalism, there's theft. We need to put strong security measures around the infrastructure to ensure that we repel criminals, we arrest them, work with state institutions to make sure that there's convictions. So security of that network is important. And thirdly, we then had to look at how do you digitalize the infrastructure, because today, if your signaling is not working, relay rooms are not working, you are going to lose capacity. We only have finite 24 hours a day, and you need to put more trains on that. So we're looking at the digitalization where, again, the shippers like farmers, if you want to use this, you can now track where your staff is, where your train is, what capacity is available. The fourth one is around looking at safety now, beyond security. Nobody should be killed on our infrastructure. We've seen sad incidents last year where people are killed by trains on railway crossing, our own employees working long hours. And it's something that really we have to address and rein in. Maybe as a common thread is to say, bring in new operators. Let's make rail to be something that everyone wants to use. So this is where the problem statement is. We have now worked with the industry to go through critical corridors. We're running 22,000 kilometers of railway line. Of it, we have divided it into two. The first 12,000 is what we call A category, where we're running coal, iron ore, manganese, containers, the chromes. This one is the one that is currently operational, but it needs opportunities. We then have B network. B network is all the branch lines. Most of them will be servicing the industry on the farms, agriculture, and others that are joining onto the main one. So we have then said we will put money to maintain the A infrastructure because funding is limited. We have worked with industry to do the assessment of the infrastructure, quantified what needs to be done, where. We then looked at what we can afford. We said in the next 5 years, we should ideally spend 65 billion rands if we are going to create capacity that moves 250 million tons per annum. Of course, this is going to ramp up from this year up until 2030. However, financial constraints are there. We can only afford just around 8 billion this year, when we should be spending around 11 every year. Now we're having a shortfall of 4 billion rands. We have reached out to government asking for funding.
And what did government say?
Yeah, no, the BFI application are being considered. There's one that is being given for Project Ukuvuselela. But beyond that, we also are looking at saying third parties I was referring to will also be coming into the system to help us close the gap between what we can afford and what we should be having. So we're not looking at only a single source of funding, but we want to say different streams must be brought in, but it must be made attractive for investors to feel that they can invest. Also, we're giving longer tenures for people to say, if I put my money, I've got enough time to recover.
We're talking about infrastructure within the context of agriculture. And the bottom line is our farmers and producers need to get their products to the market. What is the experience from our farmers and role players in agriculture in terms of the biggest challenges that they are experiencing when it comes to infrastructure?
So infrastructure is obviously a very broad topic. Logistics infrastructure is incredibly important. I'll touch on that in a second. But you also have got bulk water infrastructure. You have municipal infrastructure, on-farm infrastructure, road infrastructure, and I think probably each one of those, one can look at slightly differently and the situation slightly differently. But if I can continue from Osha on rail transport specifically, we used to, in the 1980s, transport about 80% of our grain, for instance, on rail. It's down to less than 8% at the moment, and there's multiple reasons for that. And I think it's definitely encouraged, and it's very good that there's a conscious effort to try to bring in third-party access, to try and bring in competition and investment to move from road to rail. I think we all know that has to take place, but there are certain challenges, and I think it's we'll never be back at that situation because it was highly, highly subsidized. If you take a map of South Africa's rail network, especially the B network and the silo infrastructure especially, it's almost an exact map, and a lot of that will probably not be economically viable going forward. So I think the discussions which we're having at the moment and which I'm quite excited about is to find out on the Pareto principle of the 80-20, which lines really account for about 80% of the volume in agriculture. Is there an opportunity with the PSP, so private sector participation framework, to invest in hubs and intermodal hubs, especially for agriculture? Just to contextualize the importance of that for agriculture, I mean, the transport differential is so high that, as it is, I think everyone knows, driving in here, you'll see that this is the big soya and maize producing area. But because rail transport, long-haul rail transport, is got a competitive cost advantage over road, that difference is so big that at present we produce sufficient soya for our animal feed manufacturing sector. However, because of the transport differential, the animal feed manufacturers in the Western Cape, it's cheaper to import soya from Argentina and to land it in Cape Town than it is to move it from the production areas up here down there. If rail were to be, if we realize that dream of moving at least the bulk and the viable routes back to rail, it can have dramatic knock-on effects on the sector. So I think that's immensely positive. The one thing I should just mention though is we do have, of course, despite the cost differences and advantage the rail gives, there is still the alternative of roads. But when you talk about the export sector and about 52% of agricultural products in value terms, we export abroad out of our seaports, there's no alternative to container terminals, there's no alternative to our seaports. So I would say that when we talk about logistics infrastructure, both rail as well as our port infrastructure are likely equally important.
Marlisa, we've just heard the context of our products moving from, being transported by rail to roads. Is this something that has created a situation at SANRAL where it's constant crisis management? I mean, it's a long time coming, but if you look at the timeframes, this is perhaps not something that SANRAL planned for decades, perhaps even years ago.
Yes, that is very important. Planning is very important. We've got very sophisticated asset management planning systems. And a lot of it is based on traffic counts, other than, of course, considering design parameters, etc. But we have been caught off guard in the past. If I can just mention one example, we've got the manganese mining trucks coming all the way from Mpumalanga, going to the coast, to the harbours, and we were not aware of that development. So there's a certain section of SANRAL's road network where the heavy trucks increased by 42% over a 5-year period, and it was absolutely not anticipated. Had we known about it up front, then we could have provided for it, not only in terms of the road strength, but also in terms of capacity. So it is very important for all sectors, being it the agricultural sector, the mining sector, etc., to participate and engage with SANRAL to assist us in our planning. Also very important to do this timeously, because we've got different types of projects. We've got our operational type of projects, and then we've got our capital projects. And people often think, why does it take so long to maintain or to improve a road? But if you take, for example, a capital type of project, the design period is in the order of 3 years, and the construction period is also in the order of 3 years. Immediately, the question is, why does it take so long? So before you put a spade in the ground, you need to do a basic environmental assessment. So even if you are just improving the existing, what we refer to as the black top, you need a basic environmental assessment. If you want to do a widening, let's say, for example, you've got a gravel shoulder, and for safety reasons you want to pave that gravel shoulder, you require more than a basic environmental assessment. If you are in a metropolitan area, let's say, for example, Bloemfontein, you will have commercial quarries from where you can get your material that you require to construct this road. But if you are in a rural area, you have to go and seek for borrow pits, which involves a lot of testing of soil conditions. Then you have to go to the Department of Minerals and Mining to get a license for a particular borrow pit. Once you've got your contractor on site, he's going to use water. So you need a water license. You might require land. So there's a whole land acquisition process that needs to take place. And that's the reason why the design process can take up to 3 years if you want to improve a certain section of the road. Then follows your 3-year construction process. So it literally, and then you haven't even included your 2 years upfront for budgeting for that particular section of road, because budgets is always a challenge. We've got 9 provinces, and depending on the road network kilometers in the province, we have anything between 100 and 250 active projects per province. Active projects means it can be in the design phase, it can be in the construction phase. So even though we have this sophisticated asset management program, we only have one pot of funding, and therefore we have a prioritization software. So you would input a lot of information into the software from traffic counts, accident data, etc. And then you need a rate of return of a minimum of 8% for that project to be feasible. So even though you have 250 projects per province on your books, you are not able to actually execute those projects, and therefore budgeting is extremely important. So it literally takes you up to 8 years since you identified the need for a certain development for it actually to be completed. And that's why timeously engagement by our stakeholders is very, very important.
Hubert, I wonder if I can perhaps put you on the spot just a little bit. We know that the President Cyril Ramaphosa, he refers to the importance of infrastructure very regularly, almost during every State of the Nation address that he's given since he's been appointed president, or elected president. Is there a realization from government level how important this is? Is it a money problem? In other words, that they realize what the challenges are, but the debt levels are just at such levels that we can't really address these problems.
Yes, and I think it's a relevant to the audience. The fact that Infrastructure South Africa was established actually identified, this was a cabinet decision that there's a need to have a single entity that will then look at all the different sectors, that there's a prioritized focus on infrastructure delivery of the country. Whereas in the past, each department have their own focus. They tried to get more money just from transport perspective or water perspective. But we are now the single point of entry, especially for large infrastructure projects. But that's not our only purpose. Our purpose is also to drive the strategic integrated projects. This also implies assisting, with regulatory unblockings. And now up to recently, we had something like 600 unblocking requests, of which many have been resolved. So it's also to fast track the delivery. But also, we are also tasked to identify the target portfolio of infrastructure projects for the country. I always have an argument of National Treasury to say they only focus approve compliant projects, but a compliant project might not be a priority project out of a country perspective. So our target portfolio is currently analyzing the current investment trends, especially if you look at past trends. For instance, your logistic and transport gets about around 33%, but that trend's more or less similar. So we looked at the interaction, maintenance requirements. So all that is starting to impact, and we have identified the different allocation of priorities. The National Infrastructure Plan 2050 also identified as the first phase, freight logistics, which is a critical element. And I think one can also mention there that the last studies that was done indicated the total logistic cost in South Africa around 11 to 12%, but world benchmarks around 7%. So it automatically tells you there's a problem. Also, when you look at the trade openness index, that's around 57%. So it's typically your imports plus your exports divided by your GDP. So, that tells you it's cargo to the value of 56 or 57% of your GDP that needs to be transported on our road, rail and port networks. And if there's a problem, it's going to drive up, the total logistic cost. It's going to impact on productivity of economy. And then, another point that ISA is also responsible for is also to promote investment. Now, the National Development Plan target that was set quite a while ago was 30% of gross fixed capital formation must be 30% of a GDP. Now, that must be achieved by 2030. Currently, the country sits around 15%. So we're halfway on the target. But one must also just take note that was based on the premise that the GDP would grow by 5.4% per annum. It's currently struggling to grow over the past 10 years around 1.5% on average. So I think there's lots of problems. But the fact that ISA is starting to also identify specific focal areas. My team is also responsible to do, international thought leadership. So we are working together with industry. One of our approaches is to step away from the approach that government knows what's best for everyone. We are engaging. When we do work, for instance, on the infrastructure risk barometer, the construction development index, that's developed in collaboration with the South African Institution of Civil Engineers. So it's for people working in the industry, so that we can also then, get actual inputs and test the accuracy of our, index development. Similarly, with the new GNU, Government of National Unity, driving inclusive growth is one of their mandates. But, I always say everybody talks about inclusive growth, but nobody measures it. So together with UJ, University of Johannesburg, we've developed the Inclusive Growth Index for the country. And we've also backcasted it to 1993, and we did it for local government level. So one can actually measure. There are 8 elements of inclusive growth. I'm not going to go into the details. But how did each area improve? And one can also see, how, for instance, the impact of COVID had a serious impact on inclusive growth. But the most fascinating findings out of this was that your rural mining towns and your rural agricultural towns had the highest level of inclusive growth in the country. It does not mean the highest level of growth, inclusive growth, where everybody could participate. It also looks at your mortality rate. So there's a lot of elements. 4 of the 8 elements is directly or indirectly related to infrastructure. So infrastructure is critical to economic growth.
Moshe, while we are talking about finance, we know that Transnet could do with more financial support from government. There's been a bit of tension in terms of asking for more, and Treasury saying that we don't have what you are asking for. But are you saying that without private sector involvement, we are not going to fix our rail infrastructure?
Yeah, look, I think broadly speaking, it is like that. That's why we've embraced it, that we need private sector to come in. One, they bring, besides money, they bring skills, bringing new energy. Innovation is being encouraged. So we think it's going to be a necessary pressure in the system that is going to get those who are in the system to also check up their act. Something that we have to do. And our orientation has been that anything that we should be pushing first must answer, is it good for the country? If it is good for the country, we must do it. The second layer, is it good for customers? Yes, it is good, then we must do it more. Thirdly, it is about us. So,
Moshe, I'm sorry, if I can just ask you that. Who decides, who makes that ultimate decision in terms of is it good for the country? We know politically there's been a resistance towards privatization. So you might have one group of, no, not even in our politics, but just in society, that say it's not good for our country to privatize, and another group that says it is good for our country to privatize. So who makes that decision at the end of the day?
Look, for me, I stay away from privatization or otherwise, because it does whip up emotions. But it is about inclusiveness. You say, this is too big for one party to do it. State has got its role to play. It's clear where it is playing. It is enabling business to thrive. If state is still interested in logistics, they still are in the space. They are not being displaced by bringing new parties. They must compete to remain in there. So from where I'm sitting, my department, it has to play a regulatory role. where I have to say, what is it that we need to do going forward? And if, like it has been agreed, that we open up space for private parties, I have to drive that. I'm not kicking anyone out of the system. They remain there. They get energized by competition. So it's stuff that we have to do, and it has to be an open process, because if I fail to do that, there's another mechanism in government of the economic regulatory body that is coming in. It's going to look at me and say, why are you not doing what you're supposed to do? So it's really about compliance, but making sure that as you do this compliance, you're looking at the inclusive growth that Hubert was talking about. Say, how do you bring these people into the fray? And we have left it flexible for people who put applications to recommend even route combinations, so that if they say, you have not thought about this route, but we feel as users that it's important that it gets in there, we allow it. We put just broad rules of compliance and saying, how do we make sure that nobody's going to trip each other? And we are mindful that opening this network has to be done being mindful of its capability given its age, and gradually as you restore it, you adjust the opening up of slots so that we can have that growth coming in. But we know we don't have enough time. We must hit the numbers that are required. Hence, we want people to come in and deal with these issues. We have raised issues which is mentioning of compliance, regulatory issues. Some are being addressed, and we're now looking for the PSP process driven by DOT and say, how do we link those activities to us? We've already embraced the NLCC, where we sit weekly with business. I mean, President has just been talking to Vulindlela too. So everyone now has got an opportunity to come forward and we move. And I think we're in a good space because the mode is right and people are responding.
Is there a way, I mean, not to harp on the word privatisation, but this sort of de facto privatisation that we've seen, specifically in rural communities where mining companies and even farmers have sort of gotten stuck in fixed roads, built clinics, built schools, housing in many cases. Is there a way to quantify how much has been spent by private companies in South Africa just to tackle some of these infrastructure challenges that we face?
Mm-hmm. There might be a way to quantify it, not one that I know of, but I think it's important that you meant there's a big spectrum if you talk about sort of state monopoly and privatization. I almost say those are the complete two ends of the spectrum, but there's a lot that can be done in the middle and in between. And I do believe that on a national level, some of these aspects are being addressed. You mentioned, I know it's because we don't have a specialist maybe on the panel today, but water infrastructure is incredibly important for agriculture. For the irrigation sector specifically, and there the amendments, to the PPP regulations, public-private partnership regulations from Treasury, does actually make it possible for private development finance institutions or private sector financial institutions to invest in infrastructure. But the reason is because there's a clear cost recovery mechanism where you've got strong water user associations and they collect the water fees, etc. There's a reasonable chance you can get your money back. So you can approach it as an investment. Likewise, I think in logistics now, we're also looking at the user pays principle. There's an opportunity to get your funding back. So that one, I think, is largely taken it's positive and it's good, but I do think that it is not comprehensive enough to maybe address all of the needs. A good example that you mentioned, because the grading of the roads that take place, for instance, it's risk mitigation, essentially, from the private sector. So I don't think it's an investment in the classical sense that you expect a return on that investment. It's simply risk mitigation. We did a similar thing in the Port of Cape Town now working with Transnet Port Terminals, where exporters, producers and Transnet and the Western Cape government went into partnership to create additional plug points during the peak season. But we did reach that challenge, and I think this is maybe something we don't always appreciate from private sector side, is we looked at cost recovery mechanism, but under the PFMA, it becomes incredibly complicated to do something in a short space of time. Where if it's donation funding, where you're not expecting funds back, and that's what it ended up being, it's a little bit more simple to do, but it does become very technical and bureaucratic, and that's a challenge, especially I think on the local level. A good example of almost a missed opportunity I can mention, but in this region where we are now, about 3 or 4 years ago, there was terrible flooding where I think a lot of farmers unfortunately lost their crops. And we had the situation, it was declared a regional disaster zone, which means funding from government has to be made available. And then at the other side of it, you had some of the producers who have equipment, they've got labor, and is standing idle because essentially they've lost their crop for the year. There's logically, huge potential to put those two together, but we don't have a clear mechanism in terms of how that works. So on the micro level, I think there's still a lot that can be done, but I'm at least encouraged by the fact that on the macro level, at least to get private sector investment into it, it's some of the regulations are changing, and it's quite positive. But again, I think also just a final note on privatisation. Competition, I think, is good as it keeps everyone honest. But what we also don't necessarily want is to replace a state-owned entity monopoly with a private sector monopoly. And especially if we look at the logistics space, a lot of it are multinational companies, where sentiment, I don't think, and national development aims don't necessarily come into it. So there's a lot of detail that has to go into this. So I think competition is certainly good, but regulated competition to make sure that the public interest is still looked at, and that you have these multipliers going back into our economy.
Marlies, and what about when it comes to our road infrastructure? We've all seen reports of communities and it's not even just the rural areas anymore. It's happening in the cities where residents fix potholes and they go out over weekends and they try to address road infrastructure challenges. But when it comes to big projects like building a bridge, for example, that's not something that everyday citizens can get stuck in to do. Is there scope for private participation when it comes to those projects, or is it not a finance problem from Sunwell's side? It's just an implementation challenge.
Finance is always an issue, and we will never have enough money. But when it comes to the type of projects that SANROL implement, it is very technical type of projects. You really need skilled consulting engineers. You need CIDB, anything from 6 to 9 contractors. So it's not really something that the public in general can participate in. However, our policies does make provision for PPP arrangements, so there are opportunities for it when it arises. And then, of course, we do work closely with public development or private development rather. We have, for example, statutory control departments in all of our offices, where if there's, for example, a new housing development, fuel station developments, etc., then SANROL will participate and ensure that the necessary access is provided to such facilities. So we're very much in support of development. Then very recently, we get our funding predominantly from National Treasury. We've got 2 portfolios. We've got our non-toll portfolio and our toll portfolio. So our toll portfolio is in the order of 7 to 8% of the national road network, and it's supposed to maintain itself by means of toll income. We are not supposed to cross-subsidize. But for our non-toll portion, all the funding is from National Treasury. So we are highly dependent on that. Yes, I was just thinking where I was going with it.
So there is scope for private investment.
Yes, so where I was going is that very recently SANROL established a business development department, because we are also starting to look at other sources of income other than only from National Treasury. And we will see how that department roll out, what ideas they come forth. But we are looking at things like smart roads, with our electronic cars that we are seeing more and more of them. We are looking at parking areas where cars can be charged. So there are quite a number of opportunities where one can possibly do business development. SANROL was established, of course, in 1998, and at the time we inherited a lot of land from the Department of Transport. We've got buildings, we've got unutilized land, so that specific department is also looking on how we can actually utilize those properties as an alternative means of income. Of course, road infrastructure development is extremely expensive, so we are still a long way from utilizing these alternative income streams to really fund infrastructure projects. But at least we've started the process, and I really hope that that department can support some of our infrastructure in the future.
Hubert, give us the good news when it comes to our infrastructure planning, spending, implementation. What are some projects that we can look forward to that will give South Africans hope for an infrastructure future?
Look, there's a very big pipeline of projects. End of last year, we launched a bid window for project preparation support. So out of that, we received around 289 compliant projects. Some were not actually compliant, so the list was much longer, which accounts to around 1.5 trillion rand of investment projects. That's now from SEZ's municipal infrastructure, rail infrastructure, so all the different sponsors, departments had opportunity to support. So the project preparation component accounts in terms of their requests around 5 billion rand. Now we get a much smaller allocation, but at least we now also have a pipeline. We also have projects that's already registered within the infrastructure SA approved project pipeline. Remember, project preparation support is the early on, preparation. So we are now also standardizing the guidelines to ensure that the right projects are actually investigated. So we have quite a number of projects that we did provide support for, but also in terms of the changes, our colleague from Transnet referred to BFI, Budget Facility for Infrastructure. Now, I'm serving on the Joint Technical Committee of the BFI, but Treasury is now repurposing the BFI because, again, one needs to change according to how the market and demands change. So they are restructuring BFI because in the past, BFI, on average, I don't want to generalize, supported around 5 billion rand of infrastructure projects. Now that's less than 2% of the total number, so it's a small fraction. So BFI also had to change, so that's for me a very positive. When you look at the PPP regulations, especially projects under 2 billion rand, that don't have to go through all the stages. It just needs to go to stage one, I think a B or something, but much quicker response because PPPs, when you look at the past trend, only 7 billion rand of investment. Now that is an open market because the other change to the legislation was the fact that unsolicited bids are now allowed. Previously it was a big problem. So that opens the market. There's also, we are participating with National Treasury in just fine-tuning some of those regulations to ensure that it becomes workable. Because there's also the process of fairness when an unsolicited bid is submitted and that process is not successful and somebody else gets that appointment, then that bidder should be reimbursed for some of the investment they put into the process. So it is also becoming more, I think, compliant and fair, the processes. In terms of the investment trends, there's definitely improvement. One also needs to look at that. In 2020, the Stats SA actually recalculated the GDP, which increased the number, but it did not increase your gross fixed capital formation. So at that stage, we were at 17.9%, and with that calculation change, it fell to 13%. So the numbers must also be placed in perspective. We're now at 15%, so it's slowly improving. But overall, I think it's the fact that there's a national priority pipeline of projects that's starting to happen.
And are these focused on roads, rail,
Yeah,
water?
it considers all infrastructure, also the SEZs and so forth. So it needs to consider all public-related infrastructure. We're not focusing our organization on mining infrastructure, for instance, but from an agricultural perspective, I think it's important to note that ISA is supporting a number of irrigation scheme, project preparation support, other agricultural projects. That's not our main and only focus, but we do support that. We are also engaging with the relevant departments. I think also positive is that the National Spatial Development Framework is starting to put focus for all the departments so that when you look at your logistic corridors, your rural development, that there's actually a sense of where the investment should take place and what's required at specific locations.
But Moshe, so much depends on a functioning rail network in South Africa, and I think we can all agree that things are looking up at Transnet. Give us just your honest assessment. If everything goes perfectly according to plan, you get private participation, enough money from Treasury, how long are we looking at in terms of a time frame for where we will get to a point where most of our freight is moved on rail and not on our roads?
Look, our aspiration is known that in 5 years' time, 2030, we should be able to push 250 million tons of cargo, 2030. We're having a ramp-up plan for this current financial year. We're expecting TFR to move 180 million tons. Another 2 million would come from the late entrants, which are the new train operating companies, because they won't have the full year. So we've got this ramp-up going forward. And again, we then say, if we do not get this funding coming, what we've done is to draw two lines. One is saying with our current capability, we'll take it to 227 by 2030, if nobody comes into the system. But if people come in as indicated, we'll take it to 250 million tons. So between ourselves, government, more so transport and treasury, there are conversations happening with ISA and DBSA, ITC to say, how do we then make it easy for those who want to come and invest? I will be having a session with the CEOs of the banks just to take them through what this is about so that they are able to appreciate more from us, so that when people want to be funded, at least they've got a perspective that is not a spin, but stuff that is coming from us. So that's what we're doing, and we monitor this progress daily. We've planned annual charts for some of the key corridors where we've set aside 10 to 15 days working with the cargo owners, the mines, and say, this period, let's all shut and attend to the issues that are pressing on the system. After that, there has to be a ramp-up that shows that we're moving in. So I'm confident. Last year, we moved 160 million tons from just around 150. We should have done 170, but we got to 160, which is still positive, but not where we want to be. And the message we're taking to our people is that, look, improving is possible, because the highest we ever did around 2017 was 222 million tons. So we need to quickly move into that zone, and that is going to show the migration of cargo from road to rail.
You mentioned something interesting, and it just got me thinking in terms of contesting interests, and that we don't want to just replace a state monopoly with a private monopoly, but there are so many other interests at play when it comes to logistics companies that have gotten used to using our roads as transport mechanism. We have the issue of the construction mafia, which is also standing in the way of infrastructure build. So this is perhaps not the purview of this panel, perhaps even you, but this idea of silos, of our organizations and government sort of working alone and not having a multifactorial approach to solving these problems, thinking outside of the box at the end of the day.
Maybe just before he comes, in that regard, we have noted that people that feel most threatened by new trains coming in are the guys who have bought trucks. But we wanted to explain to them that there's a new opportunity, because these private participation opportunity is not excluding them. It is a right opportunity for them to think of diversifying their business. Themselves, they can think of disposing of trucks, bringing 1 or 2 trains into the system so that they can then understand that there's room for them. Then we can use the trucks to complement services where the rail service cannot reach. So we're reaching out practically to everyone to explain in a calm way and say, here's an opportunity, take it, but I'll let it.
I'm so glad to hear that. But perhaps if you want to just expand on that a little bit, just economically speaking, you know.
Yeah, no, 100%. You know, I think, and I certainly agree with Moshe there that it shouldn't be seen as a threat to road transport. It should be complementary to road transport. Rail is always going to have perhaps a competitive advantage price-wise on long haul, but on short haul, trucking or road transport is always going to have the competitive advantage because it's faster. You can do smaller freight, smaller quantities. In the whole concept of the just-in-time sort of supply chain management, road transport is incredibly important. And part of the reason I mentioned in the beginning that we'll probably never go back to those historical levels of rail, especially in agriculture, is because we didn't have a free market in agriculture. We had marketing boards. So it was very controlled, centrally controlled, single purchaser that could arrange, obviously to optimally make use of your of the rail network. However, moving forward now, you've got smaller shipments moving more frequently. That should be seen as an opportunity for the freight industry. And I know just in our engagements with logistics companies, with the Road Freight Industry Association, they see it exactly the same way. They see it as complementary. And I think as Moshe stated, one would obviously start with the easier routes, and this is where the Department of Transport's RFI is currently out. It's predominantly on the mining routes and the multimodal routes between the metros and from a single point where we move bulk from a single point, such as a mine, for instance, to Richards Bay or Saldanha. That makes sense, but the point is consolidating, especially from agriculture, consolidating in those central points. That is always probably going to be the purview predominantly of road. So they really are complementary. I wouldn't see them as a challenge. Maybe just lastly to say, I mean, we've spoken a lot about opportunities, etc. But I'm very optimistic about it, and I don't think it's a naive optimism. If you look at the collaboration that started during COVID and then spilled over between business and government, it was on 3 things, and that was energy, which we haven't really spoken about today, logistics.
For a reason, because I mean, we've luckily, it looks like we've solved that crisis.
Exactly.
For now.
and that's what makes me so optimistic. I think we are moving towards a space of logistics. I know, the latest one that's now been added is bulk water infrastructure. So I think it's a proven methodology that can work. So that does make me very optimistic.
Marlies, something that a word that keeps on coming up in my mind as we're having this discussion is red tape regulation. And you spoke about those long time frames in terms of just building a road. It seems simple for us on the outside, just send in the team and fix the roads, but it's not that simple. Is there no way to cut through that red tape and regulation to ensure that these projects are sped up?
Yeah, unfortunately, SANRAL, but not only SANRAL, all state-owned entities are highly regulated by legislation. And the only way to really try and cut on the red tape is to continuously engage and see how legislation can be improved. Because for starters, we are subject to the Public Finance Management Act, so all our procurement must be in line with that. And then, of course, internally, we've got a huge procurement department that tries to optimize our procurement processes, but yet still be in line with legislation. We are not only subject to finance legislation, but also the construction industry. We've got the Construction Industry Development Board that we have to adhere to. So, yes, it is not an easy thing to get away from, unfortunately.
But I mentioned the construction mafia earlier, and this is something that sort of pops up every time we talk about infrastructure. Is this a problem that's being tackled adequately, or have we not yet slain this dragon?
No, this is a serious focus of a department, not ISA specifically. Our minister has made it one of his priorities. So the construction mafia, there is definitely a program. I'm not involved with that program, so I don't have the details. But there's a specific program to tackle the construction mafia. It's a fact. It's definitely impacting the mega infrastructure projects. The Construction Industry Development Board is also actively involved with that process. But I just want to add, Operation Vulindlela of the presidency is actually also targeting all these problem areas. So also in terms of, these unnecessarily red tape and delay. So there's a lot of initiatives that I think is positive that government has identified to promote the service delivery and infrastructure delivery. The construction mafia will definitely be addressed soon. I know there are things happening, but I don't have a detail, so I cannot elaborate on it, and maybe one should not elaborate on that. But government is also in the process of looking at a new growth strategy, economic growth strategy. So remember the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, ERRP, was implemented during COVID. Now, if I have to be honest, I think it had mixed results. We're not back on the same level of economy before COVID than we were then. Some sectors have improved. But, when you look at the growth strategy, and I want to use the World Cup of 2010 as a simple example, but I think a pertinent example, the construction productivity, labor productivity of the construction sector, plus your capital productivity during the years leading up to the World Cup was at its highest level ever for the country. Since then, we've been scaling down. Now, the reason was that there was a specific focus by everyone targeting a small number of priority projects. I think the country should not target 200 different focal areas. We should refocus our attention and make sure that you address that. And that's why we are doing all these different index developments, is also to identify what of those layers or drivers are actually impacting the construction industry, and what are driving the risk factors of infrastructure. Some might be simple, but for instance, governance. Governance doesn't need to cost you money, but there's actually, unfortunately, an inverse relationship between infrastructure investment and governance. So that tells you the more money is invested in infrastructure, the less governance is applied. And that's why our long-term trend in terms of infrastructure investment...
Is it because it leads to corruption at the end of the day?
Yes, inter alia.
Okay.
But the new focus is to promote governance. At ISA, we also developed a long-term plan in terms of, infrastructure development towards 2050. So, and our research has shown that we can actually grow the economy by 4% if we improve governance. We, together with UJ, also developed, it's still early stages, so it's not been launched yet, the Infrastructure Governance Index. And it's also quite interesting what's coming out of that. So it's, as I said, there are simple points, everyone talks about it, but one needs to disaggregate some of those problem areas to get to the real problem. So that's what we are busy with now. So we're addressing that. And it's also where ISA can play a role to influence policy. We engage with the National Planning Commission. We engage with the presidency. We provide input into the, various different departments, the ESET cluster for economic development. So we have an opportunity to change policy. Some will take time. Some are not short-term solutions. I think people always want to see immediate solutions. There are short-term solutions, But I think things are, in my honest opinion, definitely on the right track. I'm not saying, we can all see the problems out there in terms of the roads, but it is being addressed.
I think actually on that positive note, I would like to thank my panel and then perhaps open it up for questions from the audience, unless one of my panelists feel very strongly about perhaps a closing statement, or are you ready to take a few questions from the audience? Is that fine? All right. Do we have any questions? Don't be shy. There we go.
Thank you. I'm Rashokit Maepa, and I'm the SIP lead responsible for agriculture and agro-processing from Infrastructure South Africa with Dr. Hubert. I think mine, it's directed to Sanral, but based on the planning and the preparation work that you mentioned, that it's quite essential. And then there was also a question or a narrative around the fiscus being constrained, or the lack of of investment. So we have underinvestment. Is it an issue of lack of funding and financing, or the fact that we have these projects that are poorly packaged to actually access or have an opportunity to go out into the market and actually absorb or actually attract investment that is required? The structures that were mentioned, like a BFI, right? You will have a lot of these submissions going in, requiring funding, and they go back to the relevant departments because they were poorly packaged. And instead of getting investment at that time so that they can get to implementation, they then rerouted to project preparation facilities like your DBSA, and now ISA coming into effect to play that role. I'm just trying to get to a point where, is it really the issue of lack of funding, or the fact that there's some lacking in capacity in making sure that the projects that are prepared or are regarded as priority are actually properly packaged to receive that kind of investment that is required? Thank you.
Marlies?
Yes, for Sanral, I can say that I think funding is always a problem. Usually what we do is we submit our budget, and then of course we receive our allocation from National Treasury. In the past we were always lucky in the sense that we typically would receive what we requested, but in the past couple of years, slowly but surely, our allocation, although the allocation still increased, it did not really keep up with what we required to execute our projects. But I think your question is more related to the planning aspect, and there I can assure you our planning is really well done. There are various inputs into our planning. First of all, when you design a road, you design it with a specific maintenance plan for that particular design, and that information goes into a very good asset management system. It's very good software that's utilized by Sanral, developed by Sanral, and also utilized by other departments. Then we have a very sophisticated vehicle that drive all Sanral's routes and take all kinds of measurements of the condition of our road. That information is also fed into the asset management system. And then on a provincial level, we have what we call route inspections. So on an annual basis, we will take the information that we received from our asset management system and actually go on route inspections to verify is that really what is required. And that information also goes into our asset management system. So in the end, we have various inputs, and we know exactly what is required for a specific section of road. However, the pot of money is limited, so we would, for example, I need to do a widening of a specific road. So I would see that looking at all my parameters, applying engineering judgment, I need a widening of a road. However, we've got another set of prioritization software, which we just refer to as HDM. It's a highway development system, and when you enter all the parameters in there, for example, your traffic counts, the cost of the anticipated project, accident statistics, etc., we still need an internal rate of return of 8%. So I want to do a widening. I do not get 8%, so therefore I can no longer do a widening, but I can do a special maintenance and perhaps surface the shoulder of the road. So we know exactly what needs to be done, but due to the limited funding, we sometimes have to scale down of what we want to do. So I would definitely say when it comes to SANRAL, it is not a planning problem. I hope it answers your question.
Do you have any other questions? At the back.
Morning, everyone. Des from Nedbank. Just on the part of funding and investment into the infrastructure space, we've seen in Africa, in some of the countries where China is coming heavy to put in funds into infrastructure investment. Some of those is focused more on railway. If you look at the project they're doing between Ethiopia and Djibouti and Tanzania and Burundi, more focusing on enhancing the railway between the port to ensure that smooth trade. Have you seen China coming to South Africa to try to invest? And if so, what has been the answer? Are we open to that, or is something that we shutting down?
I see Hubert nodding his head. Would you like to take this one?
Yes, I would like to take it. South Africa is open for investment, so we don't specifically say just America or just China. We're open to all investment. We actually have lots of engagements with the Chinese government. They even have sent some of our staff on training programs to China, so lots of collaboration. Similarly with the Middle East, our minister is looking at opening an investment office in the Middle East, because there's also the Middle East expressed interest in investing in infrastructure projects in South Africa. And they just want that as access to getting more data on the different investment opportunities. But we also have what we call the Development Partners Forum that ISA has established, where we deal with all these DFIs, Development Finance Institutions, development banks, World Bank. So it looks at all the different, financing institutions and also sharing ideas and getting input. So that again, a new development bank is part of that. It includes China. So, quite a lot of, let's say marketing, but also engaging on pertinent issues that's inhibiting investment. And I think maybe a last comment, the Procurement Act was changed recently, and the Minister of Finance is compelled now to draft regulations for the infrastructure procurement. Now, ISA is directly involved in assisting the Minister of Finance because infrastructure impacts us. In the past, if you bought stationery or you would procure a multi-billion rand project, it would be the same regulations, but we feel that there's a need, and luckily the new Procurement Act allows for the specific infrastructure procurement regulations. So I think one will also see a trend going forward that your actual spending of in-year allocations will improve. Up to now, on a 3-year average, 50 billion of allocated capital was not spent.
Sure.
And it's not necessarily due to a lack of capacity. Sometimes the procurement process is just too complex, or it starts too late in the process. So Hopefully, all these interventions will also ensure that you spend 100% of your allocated budget, and that we can actually fast track infrastructure delivery.
Do we have any other questions? Another one at the back. Not. No. There we go. I see the last hand.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tabi Singh Muluti from Infrastructure South Africa, part of Dr. J's team. Marlies, you kind of answered my question, but I wanted to know what type of prioritization tool did you use to see which projects to prioritize?
Type of prioritization, like as I said, we have the asset management system, which will give us an indication of what needs to be done on which sections of the road. But in the end, we have to put all our projects, especially our capital projects, we have to put through this prioritization software, which is a funding software, and that will indicate to us which projects takes priority over others. Very seldom we will completely set aside a project, because if there's a need, the need is there, you can't just wish it away. But sometimes we would rather, as I explained before, instead of doing a widening, we would do a special maintenance, or we will do we will do additional routine road maintenance in the interim on a section of road and push the project out with a year or two until we do have the necessary funding.
Do we have any other questions? I wonder if I may then just perhaps lastly, before we say goodbye, we are talking about geopolitics, we've spoken about China, the Middle East, the tariff uncertainty that we are sort of in globally, is that going to have an effect on the materials that we import when it comes to our infrastructure projects? Are we going to see an escalation in costs, in other words?
I think the specific line items we import, I think that's a good question. I think we'll definitely see. So first of all, the tariff uncertainty we're talking about, it's obviously coming from the United States. So tariffs get paid at the point where it's received. So I think it will probably have the inverse effect in terms of that it will certainly have an increased cost for the US, where certain critical minerals and things are exported from South Africa. And part of the arguments that are currently being formulated, and obviously supported by various sectors, including our own, is to say that there are certain exports that don't compete with domestic industries in the US, but actually feed into their critical supply chains. And without those, very often, you're not able to source those locally, so it becomes an issue as if you don't source it from South Africa, what is the tariffs that you source it from alternative markets from? But with the blanket 10% and then the ad hoc country ones, I think the chances are probably that it's going to have the inverse relationship. It might increase the costs to the US. Consumer products are slightly different because they obviously your product from South Africa might be more expensive on the shelves, so a consumer might not prefer that over a product that's for instance, imported from South America. But I think infrastructure-wise, the impact will probably be felt more acutely on that side.
Absolutely, fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning for our first conversation of the Nation in Conversation series. I'd like to thank you for attending, and I would like to thank my panel for contributing to a constructive dialogue and conversation. Thank you very much.